one of the but people sort of go, but you're just reading my book, and you go, no, I'm sitting down.
Yeah.
It's X 100,000 words long, and I am annotating it, and then dissecting it, and then trying to come up with like. So you're paying for an expert, and you're paying for the years of training and expertise that that editor has,
Yes.
and you're paying for them to spend how many ever hours, because it's different to reading a book for pleasure. You can sit down with a book and you go, right, I'm going to read for 3 hours, and you'll fly through it. You don't want your editor doing that. You want your editor making notes. You want your editor highlighting things. You want your editor, because if they just read your book and went, yeah, it was that was great.
That's great. Give me
Like,
money.
it's not useful. You want
No.
someone to be annotating things and sort of going, right, do you remember back in that chapter you did this thing? Now look at this chapter where this thing is happening. How are those two things the same person?
Yeah.
Why are they reacting so differently? There's nothing in between here that shows that they should have changed there. That's what you're paying for.
It's the word. The word?
All right. Well, we're just talking. I'm going to ask a question based on that, but first I want to introduce the podcast and my guest. This is the Word Podcast. That's WRRD, Writing, Reading, Recovery, Discovery. That's what that's what we talk about. That's what we try to talk about. We usually end up somewhere else. Um, I have uh, fabulous, wonderful AP Canavan developmental editor, PhD, professor, fireball. That's one of your titles. Uh, basically, knows everything there is about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but is a great guy, great treasure trove of knowledge for everything we want to know about on how to do reviews and how to receive literature and how to have a good fucking time talking about it. So, AP, I have a question based on what we were just saying. Uh, so I recently read Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy. Have you read this?
No, that's one of the McCarthy's I haven't read.
Okay. Well, so we were just talking about review versus reaction. Like if we're on YouTube and we're talking about a book, we're talking about my reaction is I didn't like Outer Dark because it never hooked me. Now, my question to you right now is would this qualify in your opinion or in your as far as the professional guidelines of a review might go, would this qualify as a review? Because on this one hand, reaction, Outer Dark never grabbed me. On this hand, the dialogue was perfect. He didn't have to tell me a goddamn thing. The whole book. He was showing me everything as far as like this brother is immediately a piece of shit because he is taking this baby and putting it in the woods. That happens at the beginning of the book. It's not a spoiler. But and the way he's talking to the sister is it's very sparse, but you can see everything, and the prose is beautiful. It is a good book. Now those are only two or three things that I listed. Is that an accurate distinction between reaction and review, or what would you add to that?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me on. This is great, John. It's I always enjoy chatting to you. But the first thing I would say is my firm belief is that I love when people read, when they engage with the work, when they talk about the work, when they talk about reading and books. I think that is absolutely fantastic. I think more people should be doing it, more people should be involved in it, and we should make reading cool again instead of the nerd thing that it has become. The statistics keep coming in that fewer and fewer people read every year. And I think that reading for fun, literacy, is so important. It's important for developing critical faculties, for developing empathy, for engaging in the world as a more informed person. That's my own personal belief. And so I want more and more people to be involved in thinking about the works that they are reading, engaging with it. It's not just disposable consumption of narrative. That that's well and good. If that's what people want to do, that's what people want to do. But I think we would actually be better if we thought about things more. And one of the distinctions that you just sort of mentioned, the difference between our individual reading experience, how we felt, what our individual impressions of a text are. That's one thing. And then the other thing is a review of the actual text, is an analysis of the text, is an evaluation of the text. Now, people always seem to fall into the, well, you can't be fully objective. You're like, no, our perception of reality is inherently subjective, but you can be less subjective when it comes to evaluation. You can either be entirely based in your own personal preferences. That is 100% subjective. Or you can start understanding and evaluating what the actual text is doing, which makes your review more broadly applicable to a
Okay.
wider audience. It gives your audience greater information. And again, like the way I explain this, and I think it is a useful way of thinking about it. You're asked to review a dish, and the dish is a broccoli dish. Now, you personally may absolutely detest the taste of broccoli. There is no possible way that this dish is going to appeal to your personal tastes. However, if you were to talk about it was steamed broccoli, it was hot all the way through, but it wasn't soggy or mushy. It still had a bite and crispness to it. And, that exhibits that it was well cooked, that the dressing with it or how it was presented, these things can all be good. And ultimately, if you're reviewing the dish, you're trying to give that information to your audience because they want to know about the dish. Now, as part of that review, you can say, but I personally didn't enjoy it. I don't like the taste of broccoli. And that is absolutely, it's fine to include that with a review.
Right.
But at the same time, if you dislike broccoli and you say, oh, well, this dish was horrible, it tasted terrible, and you complain because you don't like the taste of broccoli, that's not a review of the dish anymore. That's about how you personally, individually, entirely subjectively are assessing your personal enjoyment of something. And that is a reaction. That is a response to the dish, a personal response. And that is valuable information. Like, don't get me wrong, like, that is useful because if you build up a reputation as a reviewer or a critic, you will have personal preferences. And the more your audience is aware of that, the more that they can factor that into your analysis of something. But ultimately, it is not the same as an evaluation of the dish because it's not
Right.
about your individual personal enjoyment, because you are not the same as your audience. They may appreciate knowing how you felt about it, but that's not an evaluation of the thing. And we have exactly the same thing to a greater extent when it comes to literature, because as we well know, the number of different types of narrative are almost innumerable. The
Yeah.
purposes and intentions and what is going on with a narrative, again, are almost innumerable. And the different audiences and different genres, these are further complexities. So if we react with reviewing a text and say, this text is bad because I didn't enjoy it, what effectively we are doing is we are positioning ourselves as the sole arbiter of what is good or bad based on our personal preferences. We are saying that no other audience actually exists. Only I exist as an audience. And it's my personal preferences are the things that are the arbiters of good and bad, which is a very egocentric approach to this. However, you can, and academics do this all the time. It is entirely possible. Professional reviewers and professional critics do it all the time. It is entirely possible to say, this was exceptionally well written. The dialogue was fantastic, fantastically constructed, was revelatory about character and characterization, but
Yeah.
still provided enough information for the reader. You can start detailing and evaluating how the text did certain things, regardless of whether or not they appeal to you personally. So, regardless of whether or not we enjoy a particular technique, we can say, was the technique done well? And that is, I think, one of the major distinctions between a professional review or
Okay.
uh, a good review, if we want to use slightly imprecise terminology, a useful review, and
Useful.
a personal reaction. The purpose of a review is to let an audience know about the thing being reviewed, not necessarily what we personally thought. That can be part of it, but we are meant to be focused on the actual thing, not just how we individually felt, because we are not the audience for the thing. We were one individual who engaged with the text. And the
Right.
recognition that there is a broader audience, I think, is very important in a review. We are not the individual, we are not the sole audience. There are other people out there who have radically different preferences and tastes. And in matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right. If you hate something because it didn't appeal to you, no one can say, oh, well, you didn't hate it. Of course, you hated it, it didn't appeal to you. But that doesn't mean that the thing was bad. It just means it was not catering to your personal preferences because it is not the customer is always right. Anyone who has ever worked in the service industry knows that is not true. Customers can be wrong. In matters of taste and preference, in matters of what they enjoy and they like, they will always be right because they are talking about what they enjoyed. And they are the only person who knows that.
Right, right. So, do you think that you can apply this type of thinking where you are, I guess, like looking at a criminal, for example? Um, and I'm not trying to make this political by any means. That's the only example I can usually think of when it comes to this type of conversation and applying this. Do you think you can apply this mindset to life, or do you find yourself ever doing that where you're looking at good and bad in general, not just as it pertains to narrative?
Of course, think about the position of a teacher, right? A teacher will naturally have students or pupils who they like more than other students and pupils.
No.
But when it comes to the evaluation of their work, that like or dislike for that individual should not be a factor, which is why we have rubrics. It's why we have, no, I'm going to grade this as objectively as I can. There will
Right.
always be a subjective element in that you're still trying to decide how well does it achieve this object or this purpose. And you look at your thing and you go, right, does it do these things? Yeah. Does it do them very well? Well, it's okay, but you're not being influenced by how much you like or dislike the person because you're evaluating the thing that was produced, not the person that produced it. Um, when I trained in law, you would have, okay, your client, they may be despicable. You may hate every single aspect of them. You may not want to be in the same room as them. Okay, fine. Don't go and have dinner with them. But when it comes down to, well, they are accused of X, Y, and Z. They did not do X, Y, and Z. Therefore, They deserve to be defended against X, Y, and Z. And it is your job to formulate that defense because they
Right.
didn't do it. Regardless of how you feel about them, regardless how you feel about the situation, you go, no, but they did not do the things that they are charged with. Therefore, we have to be, regardless of how we feel about the person, we have to try and step aside from our personal feelings and try to be professional. And more we are seeing this, well, this is how I personally feel about it. Therefore, this is what we're
That's
going
right.
to, and you're like, no, but okay, I get your personal feelings. And personal feelings, how we feel about something, that is important. It's how we experience the world. But
Yeah.
that's not the same as evaluating the thing. And in all of these, you take medicine, doctors triaging people in a emergency room. The doctor doesn't go, well, I don't like that type of person, therefore I'll bump them lower down the list. It's not about their personal preferences. It's about the criteria that are applied, which is this person needs immediate attention. This person can wait 10 minutes because they need attention quickly, but they're not immediately going to die. That's what triaging is. Doctors and nurses do it all the time. Academics, teachers do it all the time. And we go, oh, but it's impossible for me when I read a book to step aside from my feelings. You go, it's not impossible. Like everything else, if you practice it, you get better at it. It's a skill.
Yeah.
But oh well, I don't want to bother doing that. That's fine. That's a personal choice. But if you don't want to learn the skill, then don't pretend that the thing that you're producing is the thing that requires skill to produce. And having personal reactions to narrative, having personal reactions to art, there's always a subjective element, and that is always valuable. But it is not the same as a review. A review is focused on the material and is an evaluation of the material, regardless of how we personally feel. That will have an impact. It can be important information, but you can do a review without ever once saying, I like or dislike. You can do a
Yeah.
review where you can say glowing things about a text and still have personally hated it because it wasn't what you wanted at that moment in time or you didn't enjoy the experience. That's great, but that's not a review of the text. That's how we personally felt. That's the distinction that I would make.
Well, what a relief that it's a skill. Because like AP, I can feel myself like trying to say, well, I feel as you're talking, I can feel myself being like, well, I feel this way about it, or I feel that like as I'm trying to apply, this knowledge that you're giving to me. And I know that I'm so guilty of this in my previous videos with taking something and putting that on there. I've tried to incorporate things I've learned from your videos uh more, but it's definitely something that I feel more natural going towards the I like or I dislike. So yeah, that's a relief that it's a skill, you know.
And like I said, it's not that it is either or.
Right.
Like, you can incorporate that. And in fact, some of the most interesting analysis that we do is because we liked something and we are passionate about it and we want to
Okay.
share how well this thing was done.
Yeah.
That's one of the, that's one of the stepping stones. Or we can have a very passionate review because we intensely disliked something. So we break it apart to find out why we disliked it. And for a lot of these things, the first step is noting your reaction. Why did I find this section boring? Right? You go, this section is boring. Okay, why did I personally find this section boring? Because that's
Right.
interesting that I've reacted this way. So we make a note, this section was boring. Why was it boring? So then we go back and we look at it and we try to figure out, is it because we weren't interested in that character arc? Okay, I wasn't interested in this character arc. Okay, why am I not interested in that character arc? Oh, well, I don't like that character. Why do I not like that character? And it
Yes.
provides us with a sequence of questions. It's not about our emotions overruling everything. Our emotions quite frequently are signals of something interesting to be analyzed. And that, I think, is a key aspect. It's a very useful tool. If we react positively or negatively, that signals that there is something here that we
Whoa.
want to understand better.
That's fucking mind blowing, man. Because you just like merged the two things in that in that thread of words. Like we're gosh, so it's almost like being like mindfulness, like meditation, like where
Yeah.
you're looking for these thoughts to come in, and yeah, it's not like, oh well, it's just it's no, I'm feeling so that's a good like that's a good signal. It's a good signpost, right?
And, but we see this if you react, if you have that gut reaction,
Yeah,
and again, this happens in like I don't like that politician. You know, if you want to talk about a real life example, okay, why do you not like that politician? Oh, well, I
yeah.
just don't like them. I know, but why? Oh, well, my gut tells me I don't like them. Okay, but why? And getting through to the why
Yeah.
helps us understand ourselves better, understand the situation better, and it helps us understand whether it is something that is an implicit bias that we hold, an unconscious bias that we hold, if it is a rational or logical decision, if it is one based purely on whim, if it is one based solely on emotion. Are we reacting to something because we don't like someone, even though potentially, let's say there's a politician that we don't like for personal reasons, or we don't like their personality, we don't like the sound of their voice. Something about that politician is off-putting. But the proposals that they are talking about, the policies that they support, the positions that they hold, you go, right, am I better off with them as my representative than the other person who, you know what, I love listening to them talk, even though I disagree with everything that they say. And the positions and policies they enact, yeah, that's actually going to be damaging and harmful to me and the people that I love. But I enjoy seeing them, you know,
AP, that's exactly how I feel about Trump. Just so you know, I do feel I'm like this guy is fucking hilarious, but get him out of here. That's my own personal belief, of course.
but you know, and but it applies on all sides and all of these issues on the political spectrum because if
Right.
we if we go, oh, but they said this thing, and you're right, okay, they said that. Do they mean that? Or did they say that to that audience? And again, one of the great things
Right.
about studying narrative and studying literature and studying all forms of storytelling, the importance of understanding the difference between different audiences and different media. That politicians frequently say one thing one way to one audience, but will say the same thing in a very different way to a different audience. And you go, okay, so they're being consistent in their messaging about what they're going to do. But what we can also see is certain politicians say one thing to one audience and say an entirely contradictory thing to a different audience
Yeah.
because they know audience A wants them to say X. Audience
Yeah.
B wants them to say Y, which is the opposite of X. And you're like, okay, but what is the politician's position? What are they going to enact? And you go, well, I don't know because the two positions that they have said that they are going to support are mutually exclusive. And that's the thing. It's not about finding the person who says the things that you want them to say. And I think, again, it comes back to there's a certain level of tribalism. And we see it in fandom, but we see it also in political affiliation. That my tribe can do no wrong. The other tribe are evil and they're the villains and must be defeated. You know,
Right.
um, I love this author and this author's work. If you criticize that author or that author's work, you are criticizing me because I belong to that tribe. You know, quite frequently, I don't know the author. I can't speak about the author. People, famously, I am not, or infamously, I am not a huge fan of Brandon Sanderson's style of writing.
Right.
This may come as a shock to no one. But and people say, why do you dislike Sanderson? I went, I don't. I don't know Sanderson.
Right.
I've never met him. I've never exchanged pleasantries with him. I I don't know him. I don't really have much of an opinion on Sanderson as a person because I don't know him. Oh, well, why do you dislike Sanderson's writing? Oh, well, I this is the reasons. I don't like this technique, and I go through, well, you're wrong. Oh, but hang on a sec. I'm explaining to you why that technique is something I don't enjoy. And in matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right. This is the technique that I've identified. Is it in his writing? Yes. This is a technique I don't particularly enjoy, or I don't enjoy how it has been done. And you go, right. That is not the same as me saying that is bad writing.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. And to go back to what we were initially discussing, that's why sometimes I think there's a disconnect when we discuss books, that people conflate not liking and something being good or bad. So liking or not liking, good or bad. You go, those are actually two separate things.
Yeah.
And not only that, if you like something and I dislike something, that in some way that is a criticism of your personal preferences. You go, it's not. It's you expressed a preference about liking something. And I expressed a preference about that same thing that I don't like it. But that is not a criticism of you personally, because we all have different preferences. We all have different likes and dislikes. We all have different things that entertain us or appeal to us. So identifying it and saying, I don't enjoy this is not, you shouldn't be allowed to enjoy it either. That's patently ridiculous. And it's a bit like people who go, oh, this is a bad adaptation because it doesn't stick to the books. You're like, but adaptations are not measured in terms of good or bad by replication of source material. That is not the criteria. It is an criterion, or it's a criterion that we pay attention to. It's an important criterion, but there are multiple other criteria that are applied. It is not the be all and end all. It is not the defining one. It might be very important to you personally. And you go, okay, fine. But that doesn't mean that it has to be that important to everyone else. And because there are multiple other criteria that can be applied to an adaptation, you cannot then say, because it doesn't do that thing, it is bad. You're like, no, because if you take that as a stance, if you take as a stance, divergence from source material makes it a bad adaptation. That means you have to apply that to every work
Right.
that is
Lord
an
of the Rings.
adaptation
Yeah.
and apply it even if you like it or dislike it. If it diverges significantly from the source text, you have to say it is a bad adaptation.
Yeah.
And people go, oh no, but I like that one. I didn't mind when they changed those things. You go, yes. And this is illustrative of the fact that deviation from source material is a norm within adaptation. It can be done well or it can be done poorly. But the mere fact that it deviates is not a persuasive criterion that it is good or bad. That it just doesn't hold true. And you go, oh, well, the author would have hated this. And you're like, The Shining, Kubrick's Shining,
Yeah.
most people would agree is a brilliant adaptation of the source material. One of the people who disagrees is Stephen King.
Yeah.
You go, so the author intensely disliked the adaptation. Does that mean the adaptation is bad? No, not necessarily.
Well, he changed the color of the Beetle AP, so it's unforgivable.
And that's and I think a lot of it comes back to what we were discussing at the start. I don't like something, therefore, what I don't like about it is justification for it being bad. But that's not how reality works.
Yeah, and it's another thing that I think hearing you talk about it's a relief because it's almost freeing as an artist to have that distinction, to come to that understanding of this to, to some people this will seem bad, but as far as like what I'm doing, if I have an intention behind it, if I'm trying to do a specific thing and then I execute it, there's actually criterion to analyze that and to look at it um, in both ways. So that's really cool, and I think that a good example of that maybe I'm still down here in my understanding of all these things, but is with Malazan Book of the Fallen, where when I started the series, that I had this kind of goes into a different realm too, but like I had a prejudice because of the Amazon reviews, where there were some that were like, this guy needs an editor, and oh, poor Erickson didn't have an editor, and
Sorry, just to interrupt you just for a second.
yeah,
Of all of the criticisms that get leveled at works,
yeah,
this book needed an editor is one of the ones that drives me absolutely insane. And you go, what type of editor? What aspect of this book did you think didn't get edited? Because
yeah,
unless it has been self-published, if it has been traditionally published, there's usually at least two editing passes because first of all, a traditionally published author quite often will send the book to their agent. The agent may suggest changes to the text, which is an editing pass. It's a type of editing.
right,
Um, when it goes to the publisher, it will go to an editor and they will go through it and they will be editing for a particular purpose, usually to make it more commercially viable for the established audience for that type of work. But then it may also go to a copy editor, which is a very different type of editing to make sure that the presentation of it, but also factual things within it line up and make sense. So if a character is watching the sunset and the sun in this world sets in the west, but they're watching the sunset and then they stride out of town toward the sunset that the copy editor might catch. Yes, but you have them heading east. They're meant to be heading west because of that scene. So have a look at the map and say that they initially started out that way and then they walked around the outside of the walls for whatever reason, or they turned their back on the sunset to walk out of town. You know, copy editors catch internal inconsistencies as well as spelling and grammar issues and things like that. Copy editors, again, are a very useful and important type of editing. But that's
yeah,
different to developmental editing and it's different to editing for audience, which can involve developmental and line edit. And line editing itself can be okay, you have a whole passage here where you are going into the interiority of this character's experience. And that's brilliant. However, this carries on for 4 pages. You can achieve 95% of the effect that you want with 2 paragraphs.
mm,
You're only, for the next couple of pages, you're only adding a very small amount to the experience. Therefore, is that a good exchange for that minimal increase in the intensity, but you're spreading it over multiple pages? And then the author can say, well, no, actually, that's fine. I prefer to have the vast majority of what I want happen shorter to then move on to the next section to avoid people going, oh, they're still talking about this.
yeah, italics.
And and again, it comes down to authors. I think it's not just telling a story. It's about creating a narrative in the minds of a reader to create specific effects and feelings and emotions and help the reader imagine these experiences, to visualize and immerse themselves in a situation, to consider points that they hadn't considered before. Because again, narrative is the catch-all term for a type of thing, but the purpose and how we use and what we are intending to use the narrative for is radically different or can be radically different because a narrative can be a children's didactic moral storybook where there's a strong moral lesson where you are teaching the child something. That can be at the heart of that narrative. And it needs to be there because that's the type of narrative it is. But if you're in an adult fantasy text that is predominantly exploring something so that the reader can take a more nuanced view, then potentially being didactic within that text is a bad thing. So it's not that didacticism or teaching is bad. per se. It's not. It has to be appropriate for what the narrative is, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
but one of the complaints that we frequently hear, oh, they shouldn't get modern politics in this thing. And you go, but why? Why not? Oh, well, I didn't like it. Congratulations, you didn't like it. Fine. But why is that saying that the author shouldn't have done it? Well, because I didn't like it. But the author wasn't writing the book specifically for you. Oh, well, me and people like me don't like it. Yes, but other people may like it. And therefore, that is the audience that this style of writing appeals to. So, what is the problem? Oh, well, I didn't like it. Fine. No one is saying you have to like it. But that's
Right.
different to saying an author should not do this. You know, no, just because you or even a group of people, we don't particularly like something, is not justification for an author being prohibited from doing that. This book would have been better if. Better for whom?
Well, I've got a question that goes along with that. It was you were making me think, as you said, don't include modern politics. Um, in in Brandon Sanderson's fourth book in the Stormlight Archive, Rhythm of War. This is one of the things that I found a little unnerving about this book specifically. I'm a big fan of the Stormlight Archive. I look at it, as like it's fun, but as I'm reading it, I run into a lot of things, and one of them was there is this court scene in this fantasy world of the Spren, and it is set exactly as our court system in America is, where there's a judge, there's a jury, all this stuff. I mean, there are small deviations, but that's essentially how the setup is. And so for me, when I ran into that, I laughed because I was like, this is an epic fantasy. So would we be able to say that if the goal that Sanderson is trying to achieve is to immerse us in an epic fantasy world, then he shouldn't use an American court system or would that be the wrong verbiage to use, would you say?
Um, can we pause just for a sec?
Oh, pause the recording? Absolutely. And we had a quick break there where AP told me that I was wrong about everything I've been saying.
Only 90% of what you've ever said in your life has been wrong. But I think this actually hits on a couple of really important points. So the first thing uh, is it the American court system or is it a jury system? Because jury systems have existed since before America was a country. So when we are thinking about it, of course, the go-to understanding of a scene is going to be based in our experiences. That's why we talk about the meaning of works is created in the reader's mind because we have this with this comes up all the time in Malazan, where people are talking about the kingdom of Letheri or the kingdom of Lether, where the
Yeah,
Letheri and they well, this is a criticism of America. You know,
it's a good one.
but why? Oh, because it's criticism of capitalism. You, right. Do you think America is the only capitalist country in the world? Well, no. So why do you think it's a criticism of America? Because it's criticizing capitalism, and America has capitalism. Yeah, so does the UK, so does Ireland, so does the vast majority of, the world. Why do you think it's specifically American? And quite often it's the context of the reader, not the text. The text might be criticizing aspects of capitalism or a stage of capitalism. That doesn't mean it is a criticism of a particular capitalist system. It could be. Erickson might have said, oh, well, actually, I was thinking about 18th and 19th century British colonial capitalism. But a lot of those points will still transfer over to modern day capitalist systems.
Right.
In which case, the reader might be going, oh, well, how I understand this is from the lens of where I am, which is this is applying to America and how I understand American capitalism. Similar sort of thing with courtroom scenes. The vast majority of people do not have an extensive understanding of all the different legal systems in the world. They don't have an extensive understanding of all the different systems of arbitrage or judicial proceedings. In which case, because Sanderson is writing for the modern audience and wants the modern audience to understand the purpose of the scene, someone in a being judged guilty or innocent, how do we communicate that? How does he communicate that to the modern audience? Either use an existing system and tweak it for the fantasy world that the reader understands, or come up with an entirely new system of justice, which is a lot of work if it's one scene. And as readers, we might go, oh, yeah, but this is a secondary fantasy world. It should be different. But it still has to be communicable to the modern audience, or I should say the contemporary audience, because, oh, hang on, I think there's a Roomba that has just decided to activate. This may interrupt things. I will try and pause. But books are written for a contemporary audience. When the person is writing it, they are writing for an imagined audience at that time with an understanding of certain concepts. Because of that, if you're trying to write a courtroom scene, you, as an author, are thinking, well, how do I explain a courtroom scene?
Do you have a name for your Roomba?
Dobby.
Dobby. I love it. Don't give him any clothes.
Well, I was actually going to get a little tiny, uh, like ornamental sock and attach it to a tiny paper clip, and then sort of attach it to the back of Dobby so that he would never actually have the sock. It was constantly behind him because I'm mean and cruel.
Oh, that's fucking awesome. Oh my God. Dobby just
I bet, or hanging out just in front of him, so he's constantly trying to get the sock and he can't get it. But,
that's probably worse.
um, but so when we think about this, it's not necessarily that Sanderson is copying the modern American judicial system, because the modern American judicial system is modeled on a pre-existing judicial system.
Yeah,
We can historically go back in time to when that occurs. But for the reader, that might be how they understand a courtroom or a judicial system. In which case,
right.
they are going, well, this is the American system. And you're, well, how is that different to the British jury system? Oh, it's basically the same. Yeah. Or different to the French or German. But if our context is, I understand because of TV and movies how the American system works, then, oh, well, this is the American system because it's what I recognize. Oh, but there are some differences. Yeah, because it's been incorporated into a fantasy world. So it's not the American system. It's a variant of an established, identifiable system that the reader can understand, but has been blended to fit with the fantasy world, which is what we kind of want in a lot of writing. Because narrative is the communication to an audience. So if you were being absolutely abstract, or
Dobby.
but go away. If if we were thinking it has to be an entirely different fantasy world, there's a level of alienation that can be created because you go too far into the secondary otherness of this. And there is no point at which then the reader feels comfortable in understanding the world because all of the cultural norms are different, all of the legal norms are different, all of the social norms are different, all of the concepts of economy are different. If you
Yeah.
radically changed everything, the reader's going to go, but this is gibberish. I don't understand how any of this functions. You go, yeah, but it's being true and immersive to the world that it is. That is may be, but there's always a tension between creating something imaginative and different and fantastical and what can be understood by the reader. There is a tension between those points. And every author is always walking that tightrope. They're always trying to make the understandable slightly fantastic or the fantastic slightly understandable. That that sometimes they want that effect of alienation, and other times they want it to be comfortable and understood, and that can all happen within the secondary world. So, like one of my go-to examples was from fantasy work in the 1980s, and then carried on 1990s, which was Remedy Feist's Rift War. But if you look at the very, very first book, which in the UK was Magician, but in the US was Magician's Apprentice, and then the second volume was Magician's Master. But in the UK, it was one volume. But in that, you have Pug, Tomas, and Arutha are the sort of the three central male characters. But at a certain point, Arutha's sister, the Princess Caroline, is talking about how unfair it is that she's expected to act like a woman. And, she isn't allowed to learn sword fighting and all this sort of thing. And of course, Arutha and the others, one of the other characters, Roland, is like, oh, no, but you're a lady, you're a girl, you shouldn't be doing these things. And the rest are like, why not? Of course she should, blah, 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 blah. Which, if you think about it, is a feminist political statement that just because she was female does not mean that she shouldn't be allowed to do the male designated social things,
Right.
that she should be allowed to sword fight. Of course, it's a fantasy world, there's a war going on. Of course, she should be allowed to defend herself and learn how to do that. And so you have a feminist equality message that the male heroes espouse. And you go, okay, that's absolutely fine. It makes the male heroes more heroic because they treat Caroline as a person, not defined by her sex. And they give her equal rights as they would expect for themselves. You go, that's something quite admirable. What's interesting is the world itself, the Kingdom of the Isles, and in fact, the vast majority of the other countries that exist within this world are intensely patriarchal. And even the Kingdom of the Isles.
Dobby.
Dobby, get away from my feet. Go away.
They're dirty. Your feet are dirty.
You're never getting a sock.
Yes,
Um,
try and get your sock.
because just give me 1 minute because
Oh, you're fine.
that's a bookcase. You can't you can't get in the anyway. One of the plot points later on is the daughter of a prince has been kidnapped, and there's this whole plan that her father, who was the prince, has died, and therefore whoever marries her is going to become the new prince. But why, if all of the heroes are feminists and believe in equality, is the line of succession to the eldest male in the line? Because it's an intensely patriarchal society. Okay. So if it's an intensely patriarchal society, why do any of the male heroes not hold that as the central social and cultural concept and norm? Why are they
Right.
deviant from it? And oh, well, they're deviant from it because Feist wanted to make his characters more likable to the contemporary audience that was reading it. Okay. But why do none of the other characters react to them going, what are you talking about? That's so unnatural. Or why do they not react to, oh, well, of course the man's going to inherit. Why do they not react to going, but why can't the princess inherit her father's title? They don't react to it. It is purely the modern politics of the day being added in to make characters more likable to the contemporary audience,
Oh shit, man.
even though it doesn't fit with the secondary world building. It doesn't fit
Yeah.
with the politics, culture, and society that is being depicted. In fact, it stands out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
And yet, it makes those characters more likable, and we are invested in the character journey. And that's why when people object to the inclusion of politics, we always have to remember how we interpret information can be very personal because it's placed in our context. So, given how I grew up, quite often I'll look at things from my understanding of the world having grown up in Northern Ireland during a certain time period of history. That has impacted how I perceive events within a novel. But someone else who didn't grow up in Northern Ireland might view it very, very differently. And let's take a different example. If you think of Heinlein's Starship Troopers, but in particular the adaptation by Verhoeven, and
Yeah.
in Verhoeven's adaptation, there are lots of inserts of these uh, TV commercials and programs that are highly propagandistic. That they are essentially the propaganda of the state. They are jingoistic, they are over the top, they are heavy handed. But someone who has grown up exposed to that type of thing may go, but no, that's just normal. That's not exaggerated. Whereas for me, I'm looking at it and I'm going, Verhoeven, dialed it up to 11. No one would ever watch this recruiting ad for the Space Marines in Starship Troopers without going, oh, well, of course that's over the top and it's propaganda. But then if you look at some of the recruiting ads for, say, the American military in the 1990s or the early 2000s, they exhibit all of the same qualities. So if that is your perception of what is normal for a recruiting ad,
Yeah.
then Verhoeven's satire of it won't work because it's not exaggerated. It's not as pointed. It's harder to pick up that this is meant to be an exaggeration of these things for effect. It actually just, well, yeah, but of course that's the type of ad you would have. So your personal context can shape your understanding of something. And what we then sort of try to do is think about it from different perspectives. So instead of saying, "Oh, well, of course it's obvious that it's propaganda," you go, "Well, why is it obvious that it's propaganda to me?" "Oh, because it's using these techniques. It seems to be dialed up to 11. It doesn't match this. It ties in with the dialogue from here." We build an argument with evidence from the text instead of simply insisting, "Well, I don't think it's propaganda because I've seen ads like this before." Right? Okay. But within the diegesis, within the story world, within the narrative that we are analyzing, is it functioning that way? And yeah, again, like I said, our personal opinions and reactions, it's how we initially understand something, it's how we initially feel about something. These are usually signals about this may be more interesting to interrogate. Why did I not flag that as propaganda? Why did I not flag that as exaggerated? I've seen these arguments where people say it's clearly propaganda. Why do they think it's that way and I don't? Let me think about it. Let me analyze it. Well, I think it's normal. Why do I think it's normal? What ads have I been exposed to in the real world that are doing this? Are those ads in the real world propaganda? Or are they normal and fair? And it gives us then insight into
Yeah.
our own reality because we
Oh,
start evaluating things.
man. That's like soulful. That's soulful shit, man. Because like that's one of the things I love about you, AP, is like that you're it sounds when I enter one of your videos or enter a discussion with you, it sounds like criticism, which you're doing critiques of narrative and film in your videos, and but it's like what you're really doing is like bringing this large curiosity and like sense of wonder of life almost. And like it just it's like this very applicable way to be compassionate, like almost. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that's what I as you're talking, that's like what I'm thinking is that like the God, like every I just talked about Sanderson at the courtroom scene, and AP found a way to be compassionate towards that, and but also you're looking at it through a critical lens and like asking questions. But that's what it felt like to me. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think one of the driving forces for my love of narrative,
Yeah,
why I do what I do and why I teach what I teach, is this curiosity about how all these different authors are trying to tell stories and what effects they create and why some stories work for me and other stories don't. That
right,
because I can read, I am not a huge fan of Cormac McCarthy's writing. It falls flat for me.
right.
But I can look at it and go, why is it falling flat for me? It's not because the writing is bad. Like I'm not 5 years old going, "Ugh, I don't like this. Writing's bad." Because I'm not an idiot. I'm not a child. I'm not so egocentric that I think I'm the only person in the world, and therefore
Yeah,
I'm the sole arbiter of what is good and bad. What interests me is why do I think the writing works or doesn't work? What is it about it? Can I identify these techniques? Because that lets me know what my preferences are. It lets me understand the functioning of the text. Like R. Scott Baker's, was it the Second Apocalypse? That septology of books, the seven book series, so the trilogy and then the four books. It's exceptionally well written. It is a wonderfully detailed, intellectually stimulating, complex world that has volumes to say about our society because in seeing what he has done with it in the fantasy world, it is a reflection of beliefs and critiques and behaviors of our own world. That's what this is. Did I enjoy reading it? No, it was excruciating. It was dark. It I didn't enjoy the experience because it wasn't
right.
fun. It wasn't something that I went, I'm so glad I feel great after reading that. I was coming out of it going, I feel this is terrible. This is horrendous. Like I'm depressed or I'm really stressed or worried or anxious or I really didn't enjoy that section. But that's not because it was badly written. And it's
Yeah,
not because it was ill conceived or any of those things. It is very well written. It is enormously intellectually complex and wonderful and interesting. But it wasn't in that moment, wasn't the thing that I wanted in terms of entertainment. So it's not that they are bad books, that they are badly written. They didn't appeal to me at that moment in time. And you know what? Maybe in 5 years' time, I will reread them and go, how could I not have enjoyed this the first time?
right,
It's the same with Sanderson's works. A lot of Sanderson's works are written at a lower level of literacy. Not because Sanderson is illiterate, but because by decreasing the level of diction, by simplifying the word choices, by simplifying the techniques being used, by making it more straightforward, by including more exposition, by structurally repeating certain information and taking moments to re explain things to readers and re remind readers, it makes it an easier text to read. Because it's an easier text to read, it appeals to a broad audience who doesn't necessarily have the uppermost level of literacy. It widens the potential audience further than that. Does that mean that if you read and enjoy it, you have a low level of literacy? No, that is not what it means. But we're assessing what Sanderson is doing in the text. We're looking at the type of words that he is using, the sentence structures, the paragraphs, the direct exposition, making things blatant and obvious and explaining them to the reader, even when in that scene, that character, if we were being honest, would not be saying or thinking those things. The reason
right.
being, they already know them, so they wouldn't be explaining them. the reason they're being explained is for the reader. That makes the text easier to read. Therefore, we don't need to think about it as much. We don't need to concentrate on it as much. And in fact, one of the great things that Sanderson does to offset that level of simplicity in the style and the writing and the language is increasing levels of plot intricacy. So a very
Right.
surface level detail of all the different moving parts of plot. But that is because it's offsetting the fact that the delivery package is actually highly simplified and it's giving a certain level of complexity. And this makes it more commercially viable. This makes it more broadly applicable. And certainly in the modern world where levels of literacy are decreasing, it makes it a more marketable text. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that because that was Sanderson's purpose. Is it something that appeals to me? No. Is it an example of very good writing? Not really. If we're going to evaluate it on the criteria of good writing,
Yeah.
then we could take a section of it. We could ask any creative writing instructor, go through this with a red pen to highlight techniques being used that are maybe not good or are too obvious. And they will highlight a whole load of stuff. But that's not what a lot of readers are concerned with. They want something that is fun, that they can immerse themselves in, and it does what it promises to do, which is a highly entertaining, easy to understand fantasy world. Great. Should every book be like that? No. Should every book emulate what Sanderson does? No, because there is a huge variety of readership, even within fantasy, which is, let's face it, a small niche. Anyone who thinks fantasy is a huge genre, it's huge when you're inside it. But in
Yeah.
terms of the numbers of readers worldwide, it is not a big genre. And what Sanderson does is he has created something that can be read by 8-year-olds up to 80-year-olds. And you go, that's very savvy business writing. It's commercial writing. And there's nothing wrong with it being commercial writing. That's what he is trying to do. He's writing as a job. Fine.
Right.
But we don't then say, oh, well, Erickson should write more like Sanderson. Why? Well, then more people would read it. Yeah, but then it would be less Erickson. It's
Yeah.
not what that author wanted to do, what that author was exploring. Oh, yeah, but it would be more commercially successful. And why is that a good thing? Oh, well, then more people would read it. Yeah, but it would be a diluted form of the thing. Therefore, it wouldn't be Erickson being more accessible to everyone else. It would be Diet Erickson being more accessible to more people.
I
And
hate Erickson.
is that what people want? If you look at the opening of Terry Goodkin's Sword of Truth, the first book of the Sword of Truth series, I can't
Yeah.
remember. Wizard's First
I
Rule.
I read it up until I read the line about the sword having the word truth on it, and that's when I had to put it down. But the opening I read.
But in that opening, and R.A. Salvatore does this as well, but it sets up a scene. And then suddenly, in the middle of the scene, there is this lump of exposition. There is an info dump, is the informal term for it. But it is this giant lump of exposition that has nothing to do with the scene. It is there solely to explain something to the reader. Is that good writing? No, it's not. It it just fundamentally is not good writing. A lot of that information could have been integrated into the scene and therefore more seamlessly communicated to the reader
Oh,
without
yeah.
taking the reader out of the scene. So it is not good writing. But do lots of readers like that? Yeah, because they don't have to think. The stuff is just being told to them. And therefore they go, right, now I know that, moving on. And a lot of readers like that. Therefore, it is functional. It does, as the ad used to go, it does what it says on the tin. Like it is making the narrative easier to understand for the reader, but is doing it in a way that is not necessarily good art.
Well, and I remember AP. Oh yeah.
Sorry, Dobby decided to empty his vacuum bag or something, and it's very loud.
He took a shit. Um, so you worked on about 60,000 words developmental editing, one of my novels, uh, Fell Flowers Bloom. And one of the things that, man, like I felt like when going through that with you, you were giving me such valuable tools because it was like I'm familiar with my own work. And so like reading through my own work with your commentary on it, it was, it was an exchange, it was like a conversation, but it was also like I was writing as I was going. And so it was like I was taking notes of what you were saying because I was changing this section because of what you had said, those types of things. So like a lot of those things stuck with me. And what you're just talking about with that Sword of Truth passage, Wizard's First Rule passage, where there's just this chunk and then we have the actual story and stuff. And you were saying that you could actually explain all of that, like through dialogue, through other things. That's one of the things that like really, really stuck to me through the editing process with you, where you were like, a lot of times authors will explain all this shit. And then down here, though, it explains all those same things in the dialogue because they're implied or whatever. Because at this point, the author is familiar with the thing he just described or he or she just described, and so then but it's just already imbued in there, so you can just actually cut this chunk out. So like, and now while I'm writing, I am incorporating that into the process where I'm like, do I really need to say this thing? Do I really need? I was thinking when you were talking about Diet Erickson, all I could think was Animander Rake said because he was sad and 200,000 years old. Like,
Yeah, and
anyway,
understand it. Well, I think one of the things that a lot of authors initially struggle with is they have the thing in their head. And
yeah,
it's something I admire about authors. They have this thing in their head and they are communicating it to an unknown reader. Now, there are assumptions they make about the reader, that they are a contemporary reader, so they're going to understand the world roughly as they understand it, this sort of thing. And they'll assume certain things about level of literacy, what needs to be explained, what doesn't need to be explained. But an author has this concept of the world, and there are two different mistakes that can be made. One is over explaining something, which you were just discussing, which is when an author go, "Oh, I'm going to do this thing. Before I do it, let me explain what this thing is." Or immediately after doing it, let me explain what that thing meant. And they over explain things to the reader because they are not trusting that the reader will pick up the correct information from their writing. That the reader will need handholding, will need things explained to them. And sometimes readers do. Sometimes concepts need to be explained.
right.
Um, and you try to find interesting ways to do that. But the other is under explaining things, which is the same problem, but in reverse, which is it is so clear in the author's head what they mean that they don't realize that the words on the page are not communicating that. And again, it's those are the two extremes, and everything in writing falls somewhere between those two extremes. Like each time we talk about, like subjective, objective, good, bad, too much information, too little information. It's we tend to think about them as two categories, but they're not categories. They are positions at either end of a spectrum, and everything falls in gradations between the extreme points. And it is very easy sometimes to forget that. This is a good adaptation, this is a bad adaptation. This is a good book, this is a bad book, as if there are two buckets and it is either good or bad. And you're like, well, no, the characterization in this book was amazing. The plot, not so much. And suddenly you're like, well, is it good or bad then? Well, it's some of it is good, some of it is bad. So it falls kind of between them. It's not in either bucket. It's kind of, it's okay
Yeah,
that we understand it. So when we think about in particular, exposition. Exposition is a often misunderstood concept. Exposition is entirely necessary in novel writing. Um, you do have to explain things to,
Right.
but there are ways of including exposition and integrating it into the writing, as opposed to I'm going to stop the scene and now I'm going to launch into this big thing explaining everything. And it's as if the author has stepped in to go, right, everyone, hold the scene, pause, you hold the position there with the sword, right? So the thing is, this type of weapon is this, and this is the history of this type of weapon. And the thing is, it's going to allow the person wielding it to do that. And you have this giant, you're like, okay. And then they get to the end of that, and it's like, right, all done, okay, action. And then the scene carries on now that the reader has been given the information. So obviously one of the things that you can do is you go, right, why as the author did I need to do that? Well, I hadn't included the context or the background of why this thing is actually important. Does the reader need to know it beforehand, or can it be something that is slowly revealed afterwards? There's your first decision. If it is something that has to be known beforehand, are there ways that I can drop aspects of it in earlier and sort of
Okay.
pepper and little breadcrumbs all the way through until we get to that scene? So when that scene happens, the reader is suddenly primed to go, oh, it's that thing that allows them to, and you have that reaction. And you can even add in a couple of reminders just before the thing happens, which triggers the memory of all of the stuff that they've previously read. Or if it's something that can be explained afterwards, you go, right, they're not going to understand the full impact of this until later. So knowing that that is the revelation I'm planning later, what do I disguise about this here to increase that impact later? And you think about it because a book is not just a collection of scenes. A book has an arc all the way through. Each scene has an arc, but those arcs fit within the grander arc and the bigger arc and the meta arc. And we think about it as it is an entire thing. And all of these different pieces fit within that. Does that mean that every single thing has to fit plot? No. Plot is one element of narrative. And this is a piece of advice you often hear about writing. Everything must serve the story.
Right.
And the one way I would tweak that is everything must serve the narrative because story is an element about narrative action. Story is narrative action because we tend to use the same word for multiple meanings. And when we do
Yes.
that, we sometimes confuse what the advice is. So if we say everything must serve the narrative, and the narrative is this complete thing in front of us, part of that might be that this sequence is about building character. It's a character development scene. Does it impact plot? Not necessarily, because basically the character at the beginning and the character at the end, the plot is basically where it still is, but the character themselves has changed and it was necessary for that. Or it was building a foundation for a big thing later on involving that character. It's not that everything must drive plot. Everything must drive plot is something we have in certain types of narrative, not all narratives. Action movies, for instance, quite often, almost everything drives the plot because the focus of that narrative is action and plot and things happening, with momentary asides, usually to give the audience a breather or a laugh. Action comedies are a big thing where they have the whatever fight or whatever thing's happening, and then it kind of pauses, and you have the jokes being made between two people, and then all right, back to the action. The, people understand that, and we're all fine with that. But we don't expect that narrative structure and that narrative approach to apply to drama or to apply to a fantasy epic that is not action oriented. But some fantasy epics are action oriented. And understanding, even within genres, like how we define genres and subgenres, there are different ways of doing it. We can talk about fantasy epics, and we would then have to be clear about what we mean by fantasy, what we mean by epic, and what we mean specifically by a fantasy epic. But in that, you can have a comedic fantasy epic. You could have an action fantasy epic. You can have a dramatic fantasy epic, because those are all different types of narrative within that sort of almost detail specific style of writing of the details are about a fantasy world or a fantasy big epic story, but not all of them are going to be the same or realized the same way. And you can have an action comedy, you can have a dramatic comedy, you can have a romantic comedy. We don't expect them all to function the same way. And there are different genre norms that we have within them. So just because something is a secondary world fantasy doesn't necessarily mean it has to follow the same rules as any other secondary world fantasy. Terry Pratchett's
Right.
Discworld, secondary world fantasy, absolutely chock to the brim full of references to our world, references to our politics, references to our cultural practice. It is lampooning and satirizing and critiquing aspects of contemporary and modern culture and politics. And it's set in a world that is ludicrous and absurd because it's a disc on the back of four elephants that's on the back of a giant turtle that's swimming through space.
Yeah.
Like it it doesn't try to make itself a real world. It's not trying to. But it's
Yeah.
still secondary world fantasy. It still uses a lot of those things, but it uses them in different ways. So we don't say it's bad because it didn't make the currency of Ankh-Morpork realistic in how this would actually function in it. Like, well, why would it? But sometimes we apply those critiques to something else. Like, for instance, Lord of the Rings. One of the critiques that the Lord of the Rings used to attract was, you know, that the economics of the Lord of the Rings doesn't make any sense. You know, how does the Shire function? What is their monetary exchange system? What's their financial policy? Where does all this money come from? Like, what's going? Where's the bank? How do they get money? Who makes the money? Where are they getting these coins from? Tolkien never answers those questions because they were absolutely irrelevant to the story that Tolkien was telling,
Yeah.
to the narrative that he was exploring. That wasn't the function of it. That wasn't an interest of his. And it's not a requisite or requirement for that type of fantasy. But it is the requirement of different types of fantasy that are trying to explore those very things. Like sometimes we overly simplify stuff. And for authors, being aware of what is the thing that you are trying to communicate? Why are you trying to communicate it? What effect are you trying to communicate? All of that helps with the shaping of what is actually communicated. If
So
that
would
makes
you? Oh yeah, no. We can. Everybody can go home now. You know how to write a book now. You could know how to foreshadow. You know where to put the exposition. But we're gonna keep talking. But I. So let's say I want to have a character eating spaghetti just because I want to put that in my book.
Mhm.
Like Haruki Murakami does in every book of his, which he's one of my favorite authors. So I tend to do these types of things where I pants my way through the novel, and then on the second draft I go back and I put in that foreshadowing for the sword scene or whatever it is, um, or try my best to do that. But then I like to have these kind of scenes where it's completely completely useless. You could throw it away. But I like it for the sake of, um, I guess, atmospheric development would
Yeah.
be what I'm trying to do. And I'm also trying to add it because, like you're talking about those the action plot where we know every single thing has a purpose. And to me, I am like my nerves are a little frayed at that level. So like when I see it at the beginning of the movie, whatever it is that's has to do with the plot, I am a little bit like, all right, that has to do with the plot. That's going to be important. What he just said, and so like it's kind of like ruined it for me a little bit looking into all this stuff, which is good. But so it's almost like I'm like, fuck you. I'm going to put the spaghetti in, and it's not going to mean a goddamn thing because I'm so sick of that shit. What do you think
And
about that?
again, the, It all depends on the type of narrative. And I know it's a really frustrating sort of position to have that you sort of go, yeah, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Well, why does it work or well, it's going to depend on the type of narrative.
Yeah.
That but if you have a radically different fantasy world, uh, there are certain elements from our world that we throw in and everyone is perfectly fine with. So for instance, everyone using swords. Why do they use swords in that fantasy world? Oh, well, because that's what we used in certain time periods in our history. Yeah, but this has a different history. Why do they use swords? Oh, well, because that's what warriors use in a fantasy world. Why? Why aren't they all spear wielders? Be, be, because swords. And they go, yeah, and this person has a rapier. Really? They have a rapier from a specific point and origin in our history. They designed exactly the same weapon. Well, yes. And and this is the thing. There are a whole lot of things that we accept. There are loads of different types of swords from different time periods, different cultures that were used and designed and for different purposes and in response to different enemies. But in a fantasy world, we go, oh yeah, but there's no difference between a broadsword and a long sword and a rapier and all these existing at exactly the same time period in the same culture. Like, well, why would they? But we accept it as readers. And then someone, oh yeah, so the character was eating spaghetti. Well, why do you have, that means, why would you have spaghetti? That's something from our world. You're like, and the swords aren't, the horses aren't, the feudal
Right.
system isn't. And so we get into there are conventions and the conventions that we are willing to accept and the conventions that we are unwilling to accept. And Pratchett, there was a famous thing talking about Pratchett about the Tiffany problem, which is there was some criticism of having a character in a fantasy world called Tiffany because it's a very modern name. And the thing is, it was pointed out, no, no, it isn't. It is a very old name. And if you had a pseudo medieval world, Tiffany is a perfectly acceptable name for someone. But it fell out of fashion for a while. And then when it came back in the modern day, and the modern reader now associates it with the modern day and a modern name, even though there were people called Tiffany 600 years ago. Because readers can be wrong about things. We have the same thing. The willing suspension of disbelief is key for a lot of fantastic narratives. Not just suspension of disbelief, the willing suspension of disbelief. And if a reader is unwilling, then it doesn't matter what the author does. It literally will make note if a reader or a viewer goes into something unwilling to suspend their disbelief, they will point at every single potential anachronism, even though it's not set in our world. Therefore, why is it anachronistic to that time period? It's a different world. It's not our time. How do you know the timeline of inventions in that world?
Right.
Oh, well, that's anachronistic because that's an American crop. You know, but this is a secondary fantasy world. Why can't it just be from that world? We have to be willing to suspend our disbelief. Now, that does not mean that we wholesale forgive every single thing that an author does. Again, it's not about it being either or. These are positions on
Yeah.
a spectrum. But if we are willing to suspend our disbelief, we are more likely to engage with it. And it's only the most egregious things that stick out. Therefore, we look at those egregious things and say, why are they egregious? Why have I accepted the fact that coffee exists in this fantasy world, but I can't accept that spaghetti exists in this fantasy world? Why can I accept that tea exists in this fantasy world, but I can't accept that noodles exist in this fantasy world?
Yeah.
Because they are equally from our world. So why is it that it is easier to accept fantasy characters drinking tea than it is fantasy characters eating spaghetti?
Well, is that because it's a trope, you think?
That
Like
people drink tea?
with tea, like it's more, I don't know, from Great Britain or whatever, where we're setting a lot of
Well,
fantasies.
a tisane, Tisane, is a hot water, but an infusion. So herbs or a willow bark tea. You go, there's no tea in it. Stop calling it a tea. It's willow bark that has been boiled in water, which is a tisane. And that used to be the word for all of these things, but it fell out of fashion. And now everything is a tea, regardless of whether or not the tea plant has been anywhere near it. And it drives me nuts. Oh, it's a mint tea. I'm like, well, I don't like tea. Well, this is just mint. Then it's not tea.
What was that thing to see it?
Tisane. Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot used to always have a to say.
I'm using that shit. Thank you,
But
AP.
but if you use that word instead of tea, people are like, why are you using that word? That's a really strange. You go, that used to be a perfectly normal word. It has fallen out of usage, and now tea has replaced it in the modern sort of the modern lexicon, and therefore it seems like a fantasy word, but it's not. And so we use tea now as the generic descriptor for any sort of herbal infusion. And yeah, okay, but that is specific from our world, and it was specific to a particular plant. But we accept it because now there are loads of different things called teas, so we don't think of it as a specific thing. We think of it as a generic term. Sword. Oh yeah, well, like everyone always had swords. No, no, they didn't. Spears. Um, but a lot of what we get and understand about these things, we get from computer games or we get from other popular culture, um, regardless of whether or not they are historically accurate or not to any particular time period. Like
AP.
when you read the Iliad, you have
Yeah.
Iron Age and Bronze Age weaponry, mid Iron Age and early Bronze Age weaponry existing at the same time. That's a time period spanning hundreds of years. And no one is looking at the Iliad going, well, this is just patently ridiculous because that is so anachronistic that he has that type of sword that wasn't invented for 400 years afterwards. And yet, we will have exactly those arguments about some other aspect of the text, of a text, where that particular reviewer, critic, or person responding happens to know a little tiny bit. It's they were drinking hot chocolate. Well, that's ridiculous. Hot chocolate wasn't a commercial product until the late 18th, early 19th century. So how could they be drinking hot chocolate? Because it's a fucking fantasy world. It's
Yeah.
not an historical textbook. It's not a documentary about this time period. It's fiction. And it drives me insane because they will be uber specific about the need for something to be historically accurate, but then have no problem with an elf walking through the scene. And you're, well, that's not historically accurate. Oh no, but that's
Yeah.
the fantasy element. The fantasy elements are allowed to be different. You go, it's
Yeah.
all fantasy.
It's like what Peter Dinklage said about the complaints about the end of Game of Thrones, where he was like, there's dragons.
Now, admittedly, the Starbucks coffee sitting in a scene, you go, okay, that's
All right.
anachronistic.
Yeah, too much. So you, AP, were an advanced reader for Malazan, and you started doing this with Toll the Hounds.
Mhm.
If is that correct?
Yeah.
What was that process like for you?
Um, Intimidating.
Sure, I bet.
Uh, because having as any editor knows, having an author trust you to look at their work is it's a responsibility. Like they have given you something before it is being sent out to the public, and quite often you're then seeing it in a rawer form, a more primordial form than the public might see, and therefore they're exposing aspects of their writing to you that they are not comfortable maybe with the public seeing, and they want feedback. They want um, Like, does it work? Does it not work? If it's not working, why isn't it working? In what way isn't it working? Um, because again, narratives are highly complex things. And therefore you can say, well, this character arc doesn't work. Oh, well, I'll just get rid of the character arc. No, well, that's one way. Or if you have that character do that thing here instead of the other character doing it, then that will give a reason for them to do this thing, which then will fix the character arc. Because now they have the motivation by adding in those two decisions, which suddenly will actually smooth out and make the character arc more believable. Rather than just, oh, well, it doesn't work, I'll just get rid of it. Or it could be, okay, but if you have them instead of, you want them to end up here. Are you sure you want them to end up here? Because it actually would make a lot of sense if they ended up there. Like, ooh, that might work.
Yeah.
One, advanced reading, I suppose the major difference between advanced reading and developmental editing. Advanced reading, you are acting more as a reader. You are giving your feedback on what works for you and what doesn't work for you. It's actually much closer to that um, emotional subjective response because they have asked you to read this and to give them an impression of how it functions as a novel. They're not asking you to go through it, analyze it, and potentially expose things and fix things.
Okay.
I have a bit of difficulty being that kind of reader because of my background and particularly how my brain works or doesn't work. Um, I get fixated in certain things. But so I give commentary about, oh, I really like this. The reason I like this was because I'm starting to lose interest here. Uh, like this seems it's not just I'm starting to lose interest. Why am I starting to lose interest?
Okay.
So for advanced reading, a lot of the time, it was feedback on how I was responding to the text and why I was responding that way. Because then the author can look at that and go, okay, yeah, but I want you to hate this character. It's good that you're hating this character. I want you to loathe them in this scene. Because what you don't realize is in 6 chapters' time, I'm going to make you love that character. And it is
Hmm.
going to mess with you. And that is my plan. So with advanced reading, it was giving feedback of, this is how I feel about this, and here's, this is what I'm interested in, this is why I like this bit. So it's commentary all the way down about the things that you like and dislike and why you like and dislike. Um, and then over time, working with Erickson, um, I have a response and approach that's kind of unique to working with him because we've known each other for so long now. But back then, that was before we actually knew each other quite well.
Okay.
So it was a bit intimidating, particularly because anyone who's familiar with Toll the Hound, it it was written at a specific time in Erickson's life. It is dealing with very specific themes that, and at the time, I was dealing with aspects of those as well. And
Wow.
so all of the books, it was one of the ones that I can look at and go back to, and it triggers a whole load of memories, which is not always easy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it felt like a huge responsibility at the time. But like now knowing Erickson, he's like, yeah, but I'm not. He was never going to change something just because I said I didn't like it. But me telling him those things gave him the ability to make a better decision about whether or not he wanted to change something. And that's what it
Right.
is. It's in some respects it's quite similar to editing in that an editor can suggest things to change. They can tell you why they are suggesting the change. They can give you an example of how they think it should be changed. But ultimately, it goes to the author, and the author looks at that and they go, right, I get what you're saying, but I don't care. That's the author's decision. And they carry on with what they have. And that is, as an editor, I've done my job. I have highlighted the thing. I've highlighted why I think this is a thing that needs to be addressed. I've highlighted a way to address it. But the author can go, yeah, but I'm not changing it. I want that thing to do that thing and be that way. And I don't care if it alienates certain people. That's what I want. You go, yeah, and it's your book. Awesome. I've done my job. I've highlighted the thing.
Right.
You're doing your job, which is being true to the vision that you have of your narrative and how you want your narrative to function. At the same time, sometimes I will highlight a thing, I will say why I've highlighted the thing, and I will say what my potential solution is. And the author will look at it and go, you've highlighted this thing. I agree with you highlighting this thing. I agree with your reasoning for highlighting things. Yep, what you've suggested here does not work in the slightest. Because what you don't know is that I actually had this other plan, and this will allow me to do the other. Authors know their work better and know the story world better and know the characters better than the editor will. We can point things out. And through our illustration of the point, through our suggestion of a change or a way to change it, the author gets a better idea of not only what the problem is, but how readers would react to it. And therefore, it is in their hands then to write the solution that best suits what they want the scene to do.
Yes.
So an editor isn't saying to the author, you must change it to do this thing, and you must input my changes. My changes are only suggestions that illustrate what the problem is. Because 99.9% of the time, the author will have a better way of fixing the chain or fixing the issue than an editor can come up with. Or they will look at what an editor has done and go, I like part of what you did here, but I know how to tweak this to make it amazing. That's what authors do.
Right.
And it's phenomenal, and it is a skill and a talent and an art. And it is brilliant and it is amazing. And that's why I love working with authors, because I can go through this stuff and I can say, you say here that this character is good and brave and wonderful, but so far we've seen this character stab someone in the back, loot the body, and not help someone else at all. What you've said about the character is not being shown by the character. Character has to, it's not the character, well, character has to be consistent in so far as if the person is meant to be noble in the sense of good rather than noble as in aristocratic, but if they are meant to be noble and the first two or three things you show them doing are ignoble, it is very hard to come back for that for a reader because they'll have made their impression at the early juncture. And now you're fighting an uphill battle to get them to like the character. And this is why Save the Cat, as much as I loathe that approach to storytelling, it illustrates a very good point, which is if you think back to that original Superman, not original Superman, the Donner Superman film with Christopher Reeve, and we see this godlike being drop out of the sky to rescue a cat from a tree. This person has all of these amazing powers, clearly. And what they choose to do with those powers is they lift a cat out of a tree, give it to the kid, and then give the kid a moral lesson and are nice, and then fly off about their day. From that one scene, we know that Superman has amazing powers. But we know that Superman is an intrinsically good person because even with all of these powers, how he chose to use them was to save a small cat that was in a tree, get the cat back to the childlike owner, but then not just fly off, but to spend a couple of moments being understanding and caring and compassionate to the kid.
Yeah.
So that one sequence, the density of information conveyed is huge. There's a huge amount of information there. And now we have this appreciation of Superman as a character. If you think in the Die Hard movie, I think in the second one, Bruce Willis's character goes up and he's talking to the person behind the counter, and he wants to get the fax machine for whatever the thing is, and she starts flirting with him, and he taps his wedding ring and says, "Just the facts, man." It's a nice joke because it's a play on the old detective cliche. But because he taps his wedding ring, if you had not seen the first movie, you now know he's an honest, loyal, good person. He will not cheat on his wife. He is clear and open and honest about the fact that he is in a marriage. And even though this attractive person behind the counter is coming on to him, he's not going to betray that. So that's all wrapped up in it. But it also let us know that he's a family man. He has a family. He has a wife. That's communicated. So we get all of this information wrapped up in something the character does without the camera sort of stopping and Bruce Willis turning the camera going, and by the way, I'm a family man. I'm happily married and, I have kids. And although I appreciate you flirting with me, that's awesome. But really, I can't cheat on my wife because that's not the kind of guy that I am. Back to, and that's what I mean by info dumping. If
Yeah.
suddenly it all sort of stopped to get that explained to the reader, instead of using the character actions, using character dialogue to communicate that level of information. And quite often we find when we're reading dialogue, the author is going, the dialogue in this scene is to communicate this stuff. And you're, okay, there's your first draft of dialogue. Now, think about the character that is saying that line. What can you communicate about that character, their background, their position, their psychology in how they say something, what they say, what they don't say, what they leave out that the reader is aware of, or what they expound upon? And you start thinking of dialogue not just as communicating that surface level information of what the two people are talking about, but you're thinking about, well, that type of character, how would they say it? If you take, for instance, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, Anamander Rake and Krupp. Oh no, actually, Krupp has a very distinctive style of talking. We won't use it. But say Anamander Rake and Whiskey Jack, if they're having a conversation and it's Anamander Rake communicating information, you go, okay, so you do that scene. Now, if it was the other way around, if it was Whiskey Jack talking to Anamander Rake to communicate exactly the same information, you can't just switch the names. Because Whiskey Jack will not speak the same way that Anamander Rake will speak.
Right.
Whiskey Jack's position is not the same as Anamander Rake's position, which will impact how he says the things, what things he emphasizes. And that is one of the key aspects that quite often when you're reading, you go, it's great to find this information out in dialogue, but it makes no difference if that character was saying it or that character because the dialogue is not distinct to the person. And it doesn't mean that they have to have a very exaggerated accent. But Glotka in Abercrombie's First Law trilogy,
Yeah.
if Glotka is describing the route to get from room A to room B in order to do something, and there's a staircase in the middle of this route, Glotka's attitude in saying, and then you have to get to the bloody staircase. Like, Glotka is not going to feel good about the staircase because Glotka has reactions to having to climb stairs. And
Yeah.
therefore, how Glotka would talk about that route would be very different to how Logan would do it. Because Logan would go, yeah, and then you go up the staircase and then you move along here. That their attitude to navigating a staircase is radically different. And if that then is in the dialogue, it shows us more about Glotka. It
Yeah.
reinforces something we know about Glotka, rather than, and the reason Glotka was very annoyed about having it was because, again, you don't drop out of the scene to do that. You can include that information in their attitude to something.
Well, I had while I was doing my Gardens of the Moon videos, there was one specific where the wax witch um, possesses Sorry,
Mhm.
Apsalar. I think those are all her names. But so it talks about the wax witch, or the wax witch is talking, and she says something about all of the men in her life that have died and how now she gets money from the empire
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
each one of their deaths. And she has these candles where I think it's implied that the souls of those dead men are inside. But anyway, then the soldier comes over and just slaps the shit out of her. She's dead. And then she possesses Sorry. And it never says, though, in that page. And this is what I found amazing, because I knew when I read the series, I knew that it had happened, but I never looked at why I knew it happened. So then when I was rereading it, I was like, oh wow. Like all that happened is that sorry just said something that the wax switch would have said. And
Yeah.
so now we know, yeah, Erickson didn't stop and say, and then the wax switch slithered inside of Sorry's conscious.
And that ties into point of view because you could easily rewrite that sequence from
Yeah,
a more omniscient point of view and actually describe the wax witch's spirit invading the young fisher girl.
yeah,
Or you could have a very subjective perspective located in the fisher girl's mind, and she felt this invading presence because
right.
you and you can make it very, very overt. Both of those are perfectly valid approaches, and they work for lower levels of literacy or people who are listening while doing something else. Like you can make it more
Right.
overt, and if that's the type of story that you want, brilliant. And that's how you do it. But Erickson was obviously he was trying to basically give the reader a whole load of information with like the reader actually being aware of being given the information so that when it is revealed that all these things about possession, it's like, oh yeah, but I knew that she was, how did I know she was possessed?
Yes.
And you flick back and you go, hey, how did I know that? Or and we that to me is one of the things I love seeing authors do is
Yeah.
reading a section and it's like a sudden betrayal happens and I'm like, oh, I knew that person was going to hang on a sec. How
Oh.
did I know that person was going to betray them? Wait a minute. And I go back and then suddenly you look back and it might be going many chapters back and you start piecing it together and you go, oh, look at look at that language used there and look at, oh, there's a little glance that they gave there. And suddenly you start piecing it together and you realize that this author played you like a fiddle. They
Yeah.
manipulated you. And some of the best writing is where an author has manipulated us or snuck in this information and we didn't realize that they were doing it at the time. And we go, yeah, this makes perfect sense. And I think this is something people get confused about um, something making logical sense. It's within the narrative logic. So, for instance, if you have a sudden betrayal, it's not necessarily that you have to foreshadow that that character will perform the betrayal, but you have to add in enough elements that when the betrayal happens, it makes sense. So it's not that you've added in a whole other thing. So the reader goes, oh, well, that person's definitely going to betray later on. That's when you're being too overt. But it has to fall within the logic of the character. Unless, of course, that sudden betrayal is the reveal and now it's yes because they were pretending all along and the reader was never meant to know. That's a different effect, even
Yeah.
though it's the same act. The effect that the author is trying to create is actually different. I believe Dobby may be backing up into the unit. Oh, hang on.
Is this clothes? Is this clothes, sir?
Thank you, Dobby.
All right, AP. So I've got yeah, I think one more thing and then I want to wrap it up. But
Okay.
I kind of wanted to plug you a little bit as a developmental editor and the value that you can bring to somebody's work with honestly just even just the opening of the book. You've done this for me twice. Once on one project, you just looked at my first chapter and it changed how I looked at it. I was able to finish the project and change the few things throughout the entire thing just from your comments on that first chapter. Now, on my current work in progress, Fellflowers Bloom, which is epic fantasy, like I said earlier, we've been through about 60,000 words of that together. It started with about 12 points of view, and it was switching between third person in this to first person in this, back to third, with these different points of view. And you kind of looked at that and helped me narrow it down. Uh, well, you were kind of telling me, okay, when is this going on? When are we in the past now? You were making comments like that kind of made me realize that this structure that I have is not working. And also, when we were switching between the POVs from this part of the world to this part of the world, there was a dissonance there that you were informing me about. And so I was able to then, in that first one, to like take it, as we were talking about earlier, where now it's back in the author's hands, and be like, okay, this makes sense if instead of going through all these sprawling things and trying to be a Song of Ice and Fire, if I take these four people, put them in a jail together, and do a mosaic with where in the tradition of Canterbury Tales, but for me, it would be Hyperion. I just read Hyperion, so I was like, I'll just do these four guys, and they'll each be a part of this cult with their cult leader in jail, and they'll each be telling their stories, and we'll see how the cult leader has influenced them, kind of. So that was a very drastic shift. And yeah, that was just the beginning, and then we continued working together through the next about 15 chapters of the novel. But so now what I'm dealing with, AP, is I'm looking at book 2. Okay. And I'm wanting to include some of those things that I wrote for those other POVs. Now I'm wondering if I were to bring that to you now and say, here is this, here's these other POVs that I want to include in this, but the first novel is the mosaic. So do I include the mosaic for these other groups of people? Do I shift the camera from here to here to here? Do you have an opinion, or is that very confusing what I just said?
No, well, if you think like the Witcher books,
Yeah.
Sapkowski's work, the first two that were published in English are the collections of short stories, and one of them is basically an anthology of short stories. The other is more of a bind up, where you have the short stories, but you have a linking narrative trying to piece everything together to create the sense of a narrative.
Is
So
that
they're
Blood of Elves? Blood of Elves,
yeah,
that one?
Blood of Elves, because that's where Geralt had. I think the framing is Geralt has lost his memory, and slowly these memories are coming back, and that's what we're experiencing as the short stories. So it's about his recovery and piecing his memories together. So that's
Okay.
why they're shown out, are they're told outside of chronological order. They're in a non-linear sequence. Um, so there are multiple different ways that you can do this. Kevin Hearn has a series called The Iron Druid, and in it, one character is first person past tense. One character, I think, is first person present tense. One person is third person. Hearn uses different tenses and POVs for each of the different characters. So when that character is the point of view of the section, it's actually written in an entirely different point of view style and narration. And that's one way that you can do this, where it becomes apparent that when it's in this is how this person's story unfolds. And usually it's connected to the type of character that they are. And if you can do that for characters, then having different styles of narration actually can be fun. The difficulty is sometimes people look at it and go, but this is just the author trying to show off. Like
Yeah.
why is it necessary that this is in first person present and this one is in first person past? Why is this the difference? But if your point of view, say, was from a dog's point of view, and because the dog has no sense of the past. So the dog sees everything and reacts to everything in the present. You're like, okay, now it makes sense for the dog's point of view to be first person present. Whereas the humans are more traditionally either third person past or first person past. The one that third person past is the character point of view that associated with the group, but the person who is sort of the heart of the group. The first person past tense point of view could be for the slightly more egocentric or narcissistic leader of the group. And so there's a reason why the point of view is what it is. It's linked into character, or it could be linked
Okay.
into an aspect. So that's the first thing. There are many different ways of doing that, justifying it. And as long as there's a rationale for it that makes sense, that is discernible, or at least semi-discernible to the reader, um, then you can play around with that. Another way of doing it is you can have uh, the story happening and then insert a journal, like in Frankenstein. If you remember Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a lot of that is epistolary. It's the journal written out about what actually happened. So you have something that is happening, and then say every night they're sitting down and they're reading through this journal, and that's what they do at the end of the day, and we get that second narrative thread in the journal. So you can use like an entirely different style for the journal because that will be in first person, quite frequently first person past. Whereas the main story that you're telling could be in third person past tense, or it could be in first person present tense. That again, you're using a different style of narration for a different type of narrative within your narrative, an embedded narrative. And again, that can help then the distinction. And it allows you to use very different narrative voices. You have already talked about the framing device of it's a group of people telling their stories to each other. There's a perfect framing device for why you switch between different things. Um, you can have multiple points of view where this is what George R. R. Martin did. Each chapter is from one point of view. And when
Yeah.
something boring is about to occur in that person's journey, chapter ends, we move on to another chapter where something more interesting is happening. And it's the use then of the different points of view. Abercrombie uses a huge amount of focalization, very strong focalization, so that the Glocke chapters and the Logan chapter, even if they're describing the same thing in the exposition within the actual narration, they wouldn't be the same words because they reflect the character's point of view. So again, with this, you aren't beholden just because you did the first book one way. You're not beholden to doing the second book that way. But if you choose to change, you know that certain readers who read the first book, they went, I liked this because I like this framework. And then in your
Right.
second book, well, why did you change that? You changed one of the things that I liked. So you're aware that some of the people who liked and enjoyed the first book, when they get to the second book, if you have changed that format, they are not going to be happy. And as long as you're okay with that, you go, yeah, that's your decision. But if you kept it the same, the people who didn't like the first book, well, they're never going to buy the second book anyway. So,
Right. I know. That's my dilemma because I read Hyperion and loved the format, and then I got to whatever the second one is. I think it's the end of Hyperion, or I don't remember what the second book's called, but it shifts to this Keats guy. Anyway, I don't want to spoil it, but and then he is now seeing all the characters from a his first person point of view, which is then a third person on them. It's weird, and it's a weird shift, and I found it very jarring. So like I was like, maybe the way that I solve this is like I keep the that idea, and the people are still in the jail, so they can still do that. But then when I shift to maybe a different group, have it be a different part where these people are now telling each other their stories. The only thing I was worried about with that is if it would be overwhelming to like have so many.
yeah, or if for the second book, instead of the
Yeah.
people being in the jail, you go, right, take the Canterbury Tales as the actual framework, that this is a group of people on a journey. And it's you're following the journey. That's going to be the sort of the binding of the entire structure. But each of the different sections is going to be the story that they are telling about how they ended up on this journey or something from their lives. And then your third book would be when that group of travelers ends up meeting the people who were in the jail or where they intersected with the people who were in the jail. Without knowing
Yeah.
the content of it, which is obviously something you don't want to be putting in a video or in a discussion. Like, oh, this is what's going to happen in the second book. So you don't actually know.
Yes.
But again, without knowing what it is and which characters they are and the details of what they're going to be covering in it, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, this is the framework you should use. Because, of course,
Right.
there are a million and one ways that you can approach this. Or it could be that you go, okay, that the first novel I did that and that was fine, but this one I'm actually going to just have a standard third person omniscient point of view that is every other chapter is going to switch to a different part of the world and tell that story, and then switch to a different part of the world and tell that story. That you just move through it that way. And you still then have each of the different, you'll have like this plot line, and this plot line. But now they're all told in third person, past tense, omniscient or semi-omniscient, or third person limited. That you could do that for the whole thing. You don't need to change the type of narration. But all you have to do is make sure that the sequences and the structure of the storylines that you're following, that they make sense where they are. But
Yeah.
like something I've seen be a problem before is, let's say you have the A thread, the B thread, and the C thread. And A thread, it's the first two chapters are the A thread, the next two chapters are B thread, the next two chapters are C thread. So the first two chapters of the A thread, it's a lot of setup, it's a lot of introducing things. Then the first two chapters of the B thread are set up and introducing things. And the first two chapters of the C thread are set up. You, right, I've just sat through 6 chapters of setup.
Ah, yeah.
But if the first chapter was the an instigating, exciting event from the B thread, then the second chapter is the introduction from the A thread. And then thinking about it in terms of the pacing and structure, where you have action sequences, where you have dramatic sequences, where you have the relaxing sequences or the moments of respite to allow your reader a chance to catch up and breathe and think about what's going on. That you start thinking about your structure that way. So you don't end up going, but this is how it happened. A, none of it actually happened. It's all fiction. So it never has to have happened in that exact order because it didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
So you can think about it and go, right, well, there's a big lull here, and I want to build up to this, but now I suddenly have my A, B, and C threads are all having battles at the same time. Right, that's going to be an issue. So why don't I start the B thread instead of the introduction and the standard? I'll start that partway through and let the reader slowly catch up. And that way, the big battle in the B thread is happening way before the battles in A and C. And in fact, the C thread, that character is introduced in part of the A thread. So why don't I split off and do the C thread after that point? Because that then staggers where that battle happened. And suddenly you're seeing now the pattern and structure of the entire novel, not just, well, this is the
Yes.
sequence of events I invented in my head. You're thinking about the best or most engaging way to tell the story. It's not just, these are the facts of what happened in this fictional world. Yeah, but it's a fictional world. The facts do not have to have happened that way. But this is how I thought about it. Yeah. And you're the author, you can change it. Well, I can't. This is what happened. No, no, it didn't happen. You're not locked into it.
Right. I
Um,
know it's brilliant. And I like take like a lot of when I get too much into this, because I will, and I'll be like, fuck, my life's ruined. Because I don't know how to structure this novel, it's so stupid. But like I will think about back to Gardens of the Moon to Dead House Gates, where when I opened Dead House Gates, AP, I was fucking pissed. I was
yeah,
like, are you kidding me? I have to relearn. Oh my God. But then, as I got into the world, which didn't take long, and the writing's really good, and that prologue for Dead House Gates is amazing. But like as I got it, I was like, this is one of the best books ever. Like, oh my God. So I kind of that is kind of a balancing factor for me with this stuff too. But that was absolutely brilliant. What you were saying about the A, B, and C and the battles going on at the same time and the way to spread those out. And It made me think about in a Game of Thrones, like they do switch to Daenerys on a different continent, different complete different setting. But I think in that chapter before, they're talking about the Targaryens. They're talking about
Yeah.
going south, and is that
And
kind of what you're talking about?
yeah, and that's one of the ways that you can do this is so let's say you have I will use Game of Thrones as a hypothetical example. So
Sure.
you have a chapter from one of the Stark perspectives, and they're like those Targaryens are blah 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 blah. And so when the next chapter happens and it's from a Targaryen perspective, you you have primed Martin has primed the reader to go, oh, but they were just mentioned. So it feels like there's a connection between the threads.
Yeah.
They don't feel disparate because they were talking about the thing that they now explored. So if we change this into a different example, let's say that we were rewriting the entirety of the Lord of the Rings and we wanted to make it a very different story and we wanted to explore different aspects of it. So you could have Sam saying to Frodo, "Oh, I so wish to see elves, sir." And we end off the chapter with Sam having been waxing lyrical about the elves, and Frodo saying, "Well, maybe we will meet them, Sam. Maybe there might be an opportunity." And then the next chapter is actually about, say, Legolas and some of the elves hunting Gollum.
Yeah.
And what you then have is not only has Sam been talking about elves and his wide-eyed wonder about them, but so it sets up that there's going to be this connection. But then you have the jarring realization that these are not the beautiful, ethereal, wondrous beings that Sam imagines, because now we're in the reality of the elves, and they're hunting someone, or they're hunting orcs and killing orcs and involved in battle. So you have a juxtaposition of Sam's impression of the elves on one hand, and then the reality of the elves when they do elvish things on the other. So there'd be a very different approach to it. But you would still have that feeling of connection that at some point in a chapter they have mentioned this. And then the next chapter is actually about that, but not necessarily in the way that you expect. And
Yes.
it's a perfectly valid and an interesting way to do it, but it's radically different from how Tolkien approached it, because that's not the story that Tolkien wanted to tell. And this is why I keep coming back to there is no silver bullet. There is no, this is the one way to do something.
Right.
Because narrative is so flexible and the different types are so various that it's all going to be dependent on this specific one in front of you, because no matter what rule someone talks about in writing, about what good writing is, you can always find an example where someone breaks that rule and it is better because they broke that rule.
Yes.
Always.
Oh, yeah.
Because these things are about guidance for the creation of effect in a general sense, as a general principle. And once you understand that principle, you know how to manipulate that principle. You know how to create different specific expressions of that technique that are individual to your work. That's what writing is about. That creating the effect on the reader and knowing there are lots of different tools you can use to create that effect. What is the best tool for the narrative that you're creating to create the effect that you want to create? And do you have to do it in the straightforward way? Or is there a clever way to do it? Or is that going to be too clever and you actually want it to be simpler? Even the implementation of the technique is another variable.
Wow. Well, really, like I like just listen to you talk. Like I need to have like a little like cassette recorder for some reason. It's a cassette recorder with all the technology we have. I need to have like a little cassette recorder with you saying that last like 5 minutes so that I can go to sleep with it so that when I wake up I don't feel terror about the structure of my novel, because I think that that's just brilliant shit, man. Like the idea of like mentioning, because I'm going to be moving between these places, and I think that that's one way to do it. That's great. Is like these people will mention and make it seem inevitable that we hear. But your example about the elves, like that, that we're going to hear from this other person, but it's maybe not going to be what you expect. Like these people think that this woman's beautiful and gracious, and then we go to her and whatever, she's taking a
And
shit.
yeah, and you can have something as crass as that someone has
Yeah,
said this for instance, imagine setting up uh, oh the we should go and see the wizard, like they are wise and they know all of these things,
yeah,
and they're like, so then that this is the purpose of why they're setting out in this party, and you still have another section where they're doing things, all that, and then it cuts to the wizard, and they're flat on their back, snoring, sleeping off, being drunk. You go, okay, that's one way to do it. It's been done, like it's not an
yeah.
innovative way to do it. Or you can have the wizard being involved in something duplicitous that okay, they are wise, they are intelligent, but they're not necessarily good.
Right.
And it complicates the picture. Or you can have them sitting as a judge and showing how wise they are. That all of these it goes to the character, displaying who the character is through their actions, through their dialogue, not just telling the reader who they are, but showing the reader this character in a way that transmits that information, that communicates that information to your reader. That is at the essence of all of this.
That was in my document. You just convey character through action, exclamation point. And I very distinctly remember it because I use it all the time. Yeah.
But and that's one of the great things. If you think about character, how much do we know about Samwise Gamgee because of what Merry or Pippin or Frodo say about Samwise? And how much do we know about Sam because of what uh, the actual narration says? Like, oh, Sam was a good and loyal hobbit. No. What we know about Sam is how he reacts to the others.
Dolby.
Um, how he reacts to the others, how he supports the others. Because if if someone is going, oh, like I'm absolutely devastated, I don't know what I'm going to do about this, and a character goes, listen, it's going to be okay. Let me help. On a very surface level, you go, oh, well, that's showing that this character is supportive and loyal and friendly.
Yes.
Um, or you can still use that same thing to show that the character is being manipulative and finding a way to worm themselves in. So it's they have orchestrated the thing that made this person feel helpless so they can step in and help them as
Yes.
part of the scheme. But what you're doing is you're using the actions of the character. You're using what they say, how they react to situations to show the reader who they are. If a character is meant to be a coward, someone who is always afraid, and there's an odd noise, and it's hang on, I'll go and investigate. You go, but they're meant to be the scaredy cat.
Right.
Why are
Yeah.
they offering to go? Or it's a really dark passage. Oh well, I'll just. Oh, I don't like doing this, but I'll be the one to go down. What? But if they are cowardly at heart, but don't want other people to know that, then you can have them do those things, and you can say, um, "Yes, I'll go first." And it's as soon as it turned into the corridor, he grimaced and his knuckles went white as he forced himself along. That now suddenly you're understanding the character through their reaction to the situation, through what they embody, what they say to the others. Sometimes very superficially, we go, but they said that. So, for instance, you have, let's say, you take a famous liar, Lucifer. It's the devil, the prince of lies. He lies all the time, and Lucifer has a line, blah 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 blah, and the reader go, oh well, Lucifer said that, so that's the truth. But he's a liar. The whole point is we're meant to be looking at what Lucifer says and going, is he lying in this instance? We're not meant to be sure that it's the truth. And it's, oh, this person's a bad guy and they espouse this thing. This author's terrible because they espouse it. You go, they espouse it in the mouth of a bad guy, in the mouth of a
Yeah.
villain. Their idea of what a villain is someone who says that, and you think the author supports that position.
Oh yeah.
Have have you thought about this? They have a hero say something, and you're like, the author thinks that this is heroic. Terry Goodkin, there's a great example from Terry Goodkin, and I'll contrast it with an example from Wheel of Time. In Wheel of Time, you have the pacifists, basically the Romany gypsies, but they're pacifists and they're confronted by the White Cloaks, and the White Cloaks threaten them. So you have a bunch of people who don't have any weapons and they're pacifists, and you might want them in town for whatever reason, but threatening a bunch of people with weapons and threatening to kill them or hunt them down or actually hurting them sets those people up in a bad light. That how can you do that to confirmed pacifists? That is clearly a villainous thing to do. It casts those people as violent, as horrible, as evil. That's what we had in a section of Robert Jordan's work.
Yeah.
In Terry Goodkin's work, you have a section where the hero, Richard Rowell, um, is confronted by a bunch of pacifists because there are enemy soldiers from the battle between Richard and his allies versus these other people. And they were wounded. And these people are pacifists and they went out and they saw the wounded and they go, we'll care for whoever the wounded are. Doesn't matter what side, we're nothing to do with this war. But people are suffering and we're going to help them. So they go and they get these people, these soldiers, regardless of what side they are. They could have been on Richard's side or the other side. And they're treating them because people are wounded. Richard finds this out and he's like, let me at them. I want to torture them for information. And they're going, we can't let you do that. That's evil. Like that is morally reprehensible. These are injured people. Um, and he goes, well, get out of my way. And they're like, listen, like we're pacifists. We have no weapons, but we can't allow you to torture people. So they link arms and they stand there and they're like, we shall not be moved. And so Richard, with righteous anger,
Yes.
cuts through them. And it's clear that the author thought this made Richard out to be heroic instead of a sociopathic monster. Because Richard cuts through men, women, and children who are unarmed, kills them, so that he can torture other people for information. And we look at this, and the book, the narration, the position is all trying to make Richard out to be heroic. And yet the facts of that situation are monstrous and evil and worrying.
Yeah.
And there is a disconnect then from what the book is telling you and what the book is showing you. And that's where you go, I wonder, does the author think that this is justified because he put these actions on the hero? He described these as heroic, courageous actions, when what it is describing is a person armed with a sword, cutting down, killing, maiming, and injuring innocent people, pacifists. And he's doing it righteously. And that says something about the author's position.
Right. That's
Maybe,
considered.
potentially.
Well, AP, this has been an absolute delight. I know that I will be putting a sword in my next sequel with the word sword on it, instead of truth.
Veritas. Go all fancy.
To saying, wielded by to saying drinking girl named Tiffany. Uh, the final things I need from you are I have some final questions. Are you currently available for hire via editing work?
Yep.
You are.
Yeah, uh, I am still taking on clients for developmental editing work.
Okay.
Admittedly, I am taking on fewer clients at the minute because of some other commitments I have in my life. But yeah, I still have slots, and as long as someone isn't sort of emailing me to go, "Can you start on this tomorrow and get it?" Like, I email me by all means, and I can say, "Right, I have a slot here for this amount of time, and we can talk about the the number of words and what the project is, and I have a whole process for that. But it's not a case of you can just email me and I'm ready to work tomorrow. Uh,
Right.
I have to schedule things.
Yeah. In that process, if you could just tell me quickly how your process goes with getting a new client.
Well, frequently with a new client, they will email me either via the YouTube channel or message me sometimes on Twitter. Although I'm not on Twitter as much anymore, but I have my YouTube channel and there's a contact email there. And if you email me via that about a project, then I will get back to you. It may not be immediate. It may take me a couple of days
Sure.
because, like I said, I have a lot of other commitments on at the minute. But I will email back and we can set up the start of this process. Because one of the things that I generally do with new clients who I have not worked with is I ask them for a relatively short sample, about 1,000 words, which is roughly 4 pages. So I can get an idea of how they write. And I will take that short sample and I will mark it up as if I was editing it. I will do what I generally do. So I get an idea of how they write. And then I send it back to them, the 1,000 words marked up. So they get an idea of how I approach editing. Because one of the most important things when you are trying to find an editor is find an editor that you can work with, that their approach is something that is going to be beneficial to you. Because there are lots of different editors out there, and they are eminently qualified, they are professionals, but their approach or their style of editing may not be for you. It might be
Right.
the one that you respond to. So that's why I do this, so that I can get to know the author's writing, potentially what might be issues within their writing, or whether or not it's going to be a very easy process. But they also then get the feedback to know how I do it and how I comment on things because I have a tone and a style as well. They can look at that and they can decide then if maybe they want to go ahead with it. And usually, along with that 1,000 words, I say we'll set up a quick Zoom call. It could be half an hour, 45 minutes, where we talk through that. We talk through the feedback for that section. And if at the end of that, that particular author feels, yeah, AP is someone I can work with, that's when we set up, okay, how big is the project? Here are the different rates. This is how we'll calculate this. This is the timetable for it. Get all of that agreed and scheduled when we can do this. But it also gives the opportunity for the author to say, AP, thanks for having a look at this. Uh, I'm maybe going to see if I can find someone else because like I don't like how you do this or this isn't helping me. And
Sure.
again, no harm, no foul. The most important thing is that the author trusts their editor and that with that editor, they are getting the type of feedback that they can use. That that is at the core of this relationship. That the editor and the author are communicating in a way that is beneficial to the author.
Which, yeah, that's valuable. But I can say that AP is objectively good. So if you don't end up working with him, then something wrong with you, maybe. I don't know.
But but the thing is, there and don't feel that you have to take a contract with the very first editor. That have a look on the American Freelance Editors Association website. Have a look at
Oh, yeah.
or ask, go into a writing group and ask other authors. Are there freelance editors that you've worked with that you think are good? Get personal recommendations. Contact them. Have a quick chat with them if you can. Now, everyone has a different process.
Right.
And find an editor that works for you. And be prepared for the fact that professional editing is expensive.
Yeah.
Um, More so than most people seem to understand. And just be prepared for the expense. Have a look at the Editorial Freelancer of America's website. Because if you look on it, you can see the standard rates. And remember, that's the sort of the median. that
Yeah.
some editors will be much more expensive, some will be cheaper, and it might depend on the project. Some editors will give you a bit of a discount, some editors won't. It all depends on the project and a whole load of other factors. So don't be surprised when it's expensive. Get a good idea of it before going in.
Well, and that's, the thing where I think as in this new world of self-publishing, where, I've just entered into this in the past 4 years, so I'm by no means an expert, but the way, from what I have seen is that like I've read some self-published stuff. I've read some traditionally published things, obviously, and traditionally published authors have gone through a process of getting in, it's, and like you said, two passes of editing at least, through their publisher. And so if we as self-published authors want to be indistinguishable from traditional published works, or at least in the running, then I think that this is an important part of the process and very much worth that cost that a lot of people don't realize how much it is and should cost, because it's a task to edit a 250,000 word novel or however big it is.
And one of the but people sort of go, but you're just reading my book. And you go, no, I'm sitting down.
Yeah.
It's X 100,000 words long, and I am annotating it and then dissecting it and then trying to come up with like so you're paying for an expert and you're paying for the years of training and expertise that that editor has.
Yes.
And you're paying for them to spend how many ever hours because it's different to reading a book for pleasure. You can sit down with a book and you go, right, I'm going to read for 3 hours and you'll fly through it. You don't want your editor doing that. You want your editor making notes. You want your editor highlighting things. You want your editor, because if they just read your book and went, yeah, it was, that was great.
It was great. Give me
Like,
money.
it's not useful. You want
No.
someone to be annotating things and sort of going, right, do you remember back in that chapter you did this thing? Now look at this chapter where this thing is happening. How are those two things the same person?
Yeah.
Why are they reacting so differently? There's nothing in between here that shows that they should have changed there. That's what you're paying for. And it's the same, like you pay for a lawyer and you say, oh yeah, but they didn't win the case. And you're like, yeah, but you they still spent X number of hours getting the documentation together, representing you, doing all of it. You're paying for their time and their expertise, not
Yeah.
on whether or not they get the result that you want. Um, but the other thing I would suggest is if you have a group of alpha readers, beta readers, or whatever people are advanced readers, whatever people are calling them, by all means use them. But unless they are a very particular type of reader with a particular type of background, advanced readers are rarely a substitute for an editor.
Yeah.
But not every book requires an editor. If you go, you know what? I showed this to a couple of people, they enjoyed it. That's all I want to do with this. Then by all means, like don't feel pressured into getting an editor. But there are advantages to getting an editor. It is a second pair of eyes that belong to someone who is knowledgeable about how writing functions, how the genre functions, what the different aspects are, and can help you achieve your vision. And if that's what you want, then find an editor that you can trust, find an editor that their feedback is the type of feedback that you want and that you can imagine working with. Because if you're launching out in a career as a writer and you're going to be writing 10, 15 novels, then establishing a good working relationship with an editor on book one, you go, right, and I'll keep going back to that editor for the next 15 because there's someone I can rely upon. That that's useful. It's worth investing a bit of time and effort into finding the editor for you. Even if it's not me.
Right.
Find
Well, and I could say too, to what you're just saying, that like as we work together, you learned the language of how I wrote. And so you were able to do it like faster too. So like develop, like you were saying, establish a working relationship on book one with an editor. is that, then as we go through the rest of the novel, it's a lot more of a smooth process. At least that was my experience with you.
And yeah, the more you work with someone, the more you're familiar with what they're doing. Quite often, the easier it is to go. One of the things I'm going to keep an eye out for is I know that you're going to do that. Oh, look there, you did it. Right. Do you know the way I keep saying, stop doing this? Here's a big red arrow pointing to the thing that you keep doing. Don't do this. Stop doing this.
Capitalize everything. That was me.
And I think everyone looks forward to having that easy relationship, that working relationship with someone where you almost develop your own level of shorthand between the two of you.
Yeah.
And you know that no matter what that person says, that they respect you, they respect your work,
Yeah.
and that everything that they are saying is to help you make your work better. That is an editor's job. It is not an editor's job to rewrite your work the way that they want it. Good editors don't do that. Good editors look at your work. They try to see the best possible version of your story according to your desires and what you're doing to help you achieve that. That's what an editor is doing. They're trying to help you achieve the best possible version of your story, not their story, not their version of the story, not what they think is more entertaining. They're trying to help you tell your story in your most authentic way that is true to what you are trying to do.
Mm.
And if there are issues, they're not saying, oh, well, this is terrible. They go, this is what the issue is. These are the ramifications of this issue. These are different ways of dealing with it. But ultimately, the choice is always the author's. You've been made aware of what the potential ramifications are. If you still want to do it that way, then do it that way. But do not, in 6 months' time, go, well, I got that editor, and they should have told me to change that. You go, I'm looking at the manuscript. I did tell you to change that. I said this was going to be an issue.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as an editor, you don't say anything.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I have had clients who have completely ignored something that I said, and they have dismissed my advice. I'm like, that's it. That is absolutely their right. And then I have seen reviews where the very things that I had pointed out are highlighted in the reviews as negative aspects of the book. And you're sitting there, you're looking at it, and you're going, I tried to warn you.
Well, yeah. Look.
But at the same time, and I will say the flip side to this,
Yeah.
because audiences are so varied, occasionally I will look at a review of something and where they're going, I love this. I'm like, how could you have loved that? That was terrible. That's a mistake in this book. I told them to change that. They doubled down on it and you liked it. What's wrong with you, you weird review?
Right.
And that's the fear. The fear is we steer an author in the wrong direction. And that's why everything that sort of guides me as an editor is it's not about what I like or dislike. It's about trying to find the true version of that author's story. Because then, if people like it or dislike it, it's not something that I did. It's not something that I imposed on the text. They're reacting to the text. And it helps me sleep at night knowing that I haven't ruined anyone's book. That my advice has never ruined the text.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, the book is never the editor's.
Yeah.
The book is the author's. The story is the author's. The characters are the author's. And an editor's place is to help the author, never to step into the place of the author.
And this editor has significantly enriched my book, has made me enjoy writing it more. AP Canavan, again, everybody. Just brilliant guy. Check out his channel at a critical dragon. I got that right.
Yes.
Critical Dragon. And AP, I'm going to include all the links in the notes below, so that people can just click, reach your channel, reach you. And it has been such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for sharing your expertise in this with us in this world and helping us navigate it.
I'm not an expert, but thank you very much for the conversation. I love talking about this stuff with you because, again, like you come at it from your point of view, your angle, your vision and voice, and it's unique to you. And, we could look at exactly the same scene, and I'm like, John, like, what are you trying to do here? And you're like, oh, but I'm doing this thing. I'm like, but what if you did this? And you're like, no, that would never work because of that's what I love. That it's not me telling you what to do because it's your dream, your vision, your story, your narrative. And every time I make a suggestion to you, you're like, oh, well, oh, I know how I can make this work. And very rarely is it what I had in my mind, but you make it work because you fit that with your vision. It helps you achieve your vision. And I love chatting about these things because authors have a different perspective on it than readers. And as an editor, you kind of sit between those positions sometimes. So it's wonderful having discussions with authors who are passionate about storytelling and who are passionate about their stories. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, JP. Thank you for taking the time. Have a great day.